logistical problems from moving things from Bandaka to Bikoro, very 50 kilometers, but as you know, it takes more than a day to cross, and how difficult it is to fight Ebola in that area. But we're trying our best to address it, and we hope that the 2018 we would be or cut it from its bud. But I would like to say that it's going to be a difficult fight. But one thing that I am really confident, the DRC has really a strong, and good experience in fighting Ebola. And they're doing their best, and that gives us hope, and we should continue to support them in order to finish this as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. And Helen, no need to apologize. Questions on other health topics can be taken as well. We, as WHO, we respond to many health emergencies around the world, and I'm sure we will be able to send you the exact numbers immediately after this press briefing. So thanks for that. Now we will go to South Africa. We have Sophie from SABC, South African broadcaster. Sophie?
I just want to ask about the vaccine. There is a perception in some African countries, but also generally on the developing nations, that they are being targeted as guinea pigs for trial and on vaccine, but that people understand the importance of one is found, and they are willing that the minister can offer this to them. There's a perception that only the poorer countries are being targeted for such trials and the research thereof. We saw what happened with the statement from a particular doctor in Europe, where he was indicating that perhaps they should use Africa to do the tests, the trials.
So we thank you so much. We have, I think, spoken about this, and I will give you our experience to convince that my African compatriots, actually, they shouldn't worry about being, a testing ground. We have started solidarity trial on therapeutics, as you know. And we have 27 countries now involved throughout the world in the trial. Some countries are from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, use the same protocol, and from Latin America and elsewhere. And when it comes to vaccines, WHO's position is the same, using the same protocol in the whole world, the same in all countries involved. And we don't tolerate any targeting of a continent or a country to do a trial or using it as a testing ground. We don't. So future trials, when clinical trials start on vaccines, we will make sure those are used and applied the same way in all countries. Actually, the vaccines that are now in the front will be moving into clinical trials soon, and we will take this seriously, and we will make sure that the same protocol and same guideline is applied. So thank you for that, and WHO will be at the forefront to safeguard that. Thank you.
Yeah, and also we're working on standardized protocols for vaccine trials. which will allow governments to be much more involved and engaged in regulating and managing trials that would occur, and in strengthening regulatory ethical authorities at national level to support that. And can I just, maybe while I have the floor again, just come back to Helen on the data thing. We still have 12 probable cases, but two health workers amongst that, Helen. We have 8 deaths, including 4 at the community level. So that is a 67% fatality rate, which is not unusual at the beginning of an outbreak. But what is concerning, number one, 2 health workers being affected and 2 deaths at the community level. And you and many of the other scientific journalists who track Ebola know how dangerous those circumstances can be and how explosive they can be. We have Ebola treatment centres set up. Currently there are 4 alive confirmed cases in those 2 in the ETC, but 2, again, people still at community level. And again, this negotiation for having people come for care. So if you think about the risk factors that drive disease, the fact that there have been deaths in the community, the fact that there are cases at community level who don't wish to come forward and be treated in an Ebola treatment centre, and the fact that we already have health workers affected in the initial event around this disease, all are worrying. There are cases in 6 health areas in 3 health zones. So those numbers are distributed across quite a large area. And we're still obviously investigating the origin of the outbreak. The sequencing, as we've said before, is confirmed it's a new outbreak on Equator due to Ebola virus Zaire, which is the same strain as the previous outbreak, but it's a different virus in the sense that it's a new emergence from there. 289 contacts have been identified for follow-up. In the last 24 hours, we've managed to see and track and temperature test 88% of those, and we've currently vaccinated 600 people in response to the outbreak, both contacts and contacts of contacts, as well as 227 in a number of frontline health centres and hospitals across the region. We're also deploying Go Data, which is an integrated data management system for field data capture and other processes to move very quickly. It allows comparison of lab data with contact and case data in a much more efficient manner. We're doing that in conjunction with the Ministry of Health, and also setting up a much broader EWARS, or an early warning and response system, across the whole province to be able to pick up any alerts of any similar disease in the coming weeks.
Many thanks, Dr. Ryan, for providing these figures for Helen. We had a couple of so asked immediately, can I get these figures too? So here we go. We have a time for 1, maximum 2 more questions. We will go now to Moscow, where we press Moscow correspondent Dasha Litvinina. Dasha, if you're here, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. So my Russia and its, well, remarkably low toll. As you probably know, Russia's official count of COVID-19 deaths does not include those positive for COVID-19, but died from other causes. The Russian government insists that they're classifying deaths in strict accordance with the WHO guidelines. So my question is, does this approach follow the WHO guideline in recording COVID deaths, in your opinion? And what's your take on generally why there are so few deaths in Russia? Thank you.
Yes. I think in terms of tracking the disease, and we've all tracked the emergence and spread and amplification of the disease in Russia, and it's been a very similar pattern to many of the other developed nations. Therefore, the low death rate is difficult to understand in the context of the population and the health systems across the European region being quite similar in terms of their sophistication and availability. The age of people in the Russian Federation is not greatly different. Other nations, neither is the profile of underlying conditions. So certainly between countries there can be differences depending on what is reported. So for example, many countries, all deaths in COVID, reporting their deaths in real time, and it's not related to certification of death by the doctor themselves in the official process. It's very often reporting there's been a death in a confirmed case. And in some cases that could overestimate deaths because they're main causes of disease. In the case of disease death certification, there is a standardized process that WHO has developed and has circulated to member states for the proper certification of death in the case of COVID-19. And again, like all death certification, it is complicated, and there are underlying and other conditions, the primary condition of the cause of death and what was contributing to that can be interpreted in different ways. I'm not an expert on ICD classification nor on death certification, but it certainly is possible that it is the way in which physicians are codifying or classifying deaths. I don't think that's been done in any negative way and not in a systematic fashion. But it certainly is unusual that the number of deaths in relation to the number of confirmed cases. But again, in the Russian Federation, they've been doing a lot of testing, and they've ramped up their testing very, very fast. So you do see in situations where testing is ramped up and many more people are tested, that you do see a relatively low fatality rate. But it will be important that authorities review the way in which death certification is done to reassure themselves that they are accurately certifying deaths in the appropriate way.
Only one short comment, sorry, DG. One short comment about, not about Russia, but about deaths. I mean, many countries will go back and they will look at their medical records, the death certificates, and there will be changes. I mean, I think it's safe to say, and we've seen this in a number of countries already, revisions of the numbers of deaths. And this comes from a variety of reasons Mike has outlined already. But it is important that, this may happen, and we may see large increases in deaths, maybe not. But that comes from a review. You know, after many countries are out of the intensity of that peak of that outbreak, they'll go back and look at medical records of cases that were directly associated with infections or those associated with COVID infection. And so we expect to see revisions in numbers of deaths in many countries.
Many thanks, Dr. Van Kerkhove and Dr. Rand. So we will take a last question for today, and we will go to Jim from Westwood One. Jim, can you unmute yourself, please?
Apologize for that. Thank you very much. I was wondering if I remember correctly, at the very beginning of this, when the so-called lockdown measures, for lack of a better word, were implemented, and other measures, social distancing and masks and everything, a lot of it had to do with hospital capacity, making sure that there was room in hospitals, that there was ventilators, proper PPE for the healthcare workers. That's the reason for all the lockdowns. As long as hospital capacity is set, that there is capacity, is that the reason why it's okay to start to open things up more, or are there other reasons not to, if I ask that question properly?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's difficult to answer your question because a million critically ill people. So I don't think I think it is one of the factors that it should be considered when considering shutting down society in order not to overwhelm the system. And I think your point is valid in that regard. But there are many other considerations that need to be made. And I don't believe that was the reason that that governments shut down everything. I think it was certainly one that was driving it. And people have spoken about flattening the curve. I don't particularly like that term myself. I'd rather we go for trying a bit more ambitious, not just spreading disease out over time, but as we do that, trying to reduce the ultimate impact of the disease, and actually not just flattening this thing down and experiencing it for a term, but at a level at which we can bear. But we're a little bit more ambitious in our public health objectives in trying to truly suppress the disease and do, like Maria said, countries like New Zealand have managed to achieve. Get to zero. Not very easy, very, very complicated in many, many countries because of so many contextual factors around population, poverty, connections with other countries. So this is a very difficult thing to achieve. But in terms of the factors where I believe that many countries, as the disease accelerated, and as it became very difficult to understand the transmission dynamics, who was infected, who was not infected, the absence of systematic testing for suspect cases, not see where the virus was. And we're seeing their hospitals fill up. And they look at these two factors. We know under pressure, we know this disease is spreading, we can't see the virus, we don't have the testing, we don't have the contact tracing, we don't understand where this disease is, but we need to protect our society. And it's not just about protecting the health system. Ultimately, it's about saving lives. And an overwhelmed has less lives. How do we reduce the damage? How do we reduce the health consequence of this? If we allow the system to become overwhelmed, the situation will even get worse. More people will die because they will not get any care or any intensive care. And I think many governments around the world were faced with very difficult choices. Very difficult choices. Governments made that call early. Some governments made that call later. Some governments shut down all of their society. Some chose not to shut down everything. Some chose to continue with their public health surveillance, persevere with the public health measures. Some gave up on that because they felt it was unmanageable in the context of the fire they were fighting. So I believe the decision in each country was unique to the context of the country. I don't believe there was a one-size-fits-all. I don't believe there was a single algorithm that anybody used. But I think while it's partially true that governments shut down because of fear of the system becoming overwhelmed, I don't believe that was the only factor that governments considered. And in some could see where the virus was, where they had a good handle on how the disease was transmitting, and less likely to have to shut down the whole system. Again, history will tell who did that at the right time and in the right combination. But certainly it would seem, at least on the face, that governments who acted early, governments who acted comprehensively, governments that acted with cohesive, comprehensive responses tended to flatten that curve, protect their health system, and are emerging now in good order from at least this wave of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. I'll add briefly to what Mike said, and then I will move to another follow-up question that we just received. When countries resorted to lockdowns, social distancing, and so on, and as you said, masks, and so on, the hospital capacity could be one, but it varies, as Mike said, from country to country, and many countries actually were aiming to suppress and control the epidemic itself. And they used the lockdown or social distancing to strengthen their testing, tracing, and quarantine, and suppressed and controlled the virus. And that's, as you know, some countries are now not seeing even cases. So it can help in addressing the overwhelming whatever situation we have seen in some countries in the health system. So addressing the number of cases that was flowing to overwhelm the hospitals, but at the same time, when you use it to strengthen your testing, you can also suppress and control. So as Mike said, it can differ from country to country. And our advice has been actually for countries to use the lockdown and social distancing to hone and strengthen their public health capacity, the testing, tracing, quarantine, with the aim of suppressing and controlling the virus. And still that holds true. We encourage countries to move in that direction. Then on the follow-up question from Helen, there was a specific part of it which I didn't address, if we're receiving money for the Ebola in Western DRC from the US. As I said earlier, we have discussed with Secretary to cooperate in helping DRC, but I didn't say, or we're not receiving funding directly from the US. But I said it many times. I think in our relationship with the US, it's not about the money. You know, working together, the relationship, I think, is more important, and hope we will work side by side to control or contain the outbreak in Western DRC as soon as possible. But the cooperation doesn't involve the financing part directly to WHO. Thank you.
We will conclude this press briefing with this last answer and clarification. We will have an audio file sent to you very shortly, and then transcript will be posted tomorrow. I wish everyone. I understand that Dr. Ryan has.
No, just a clarification, because I said 12 cases of Ebola in Equator Province in DRC. That's 9 laboratory confirmed and 3. We're very confident that those probable cases, given their epidemiologic links with confirmed cases, but some of these people obviously cannot, they're no longer with us. So 12 cases the WHO has, and the country have, of Ebola, of which 9 are laboratory confirmed and 3 are cases based on their epidemiologic link to confirmed cases.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ryan, for this clarification. So I wish a very nice evening to everyone.
Okay, so thank you, Tariq, and who have joined today, and look forward to you again on Friday. Thank you.
out that, you know, we rotate to walk around?
Yeah, it's very,
And you only get one question. Yours is the fourth question. If you're in the center. Right? Right? Yeah. Good. Let's take it out. A little hard to follow this part.
yeah, I mean, literally, it starts at 9%. Yeah, we're going to do
Sure.
what we're going to do on board. There's nothing to do. Oh, yeah.
It's a good cast, actually.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of a nightmare. But now, it takes up half the thing. So it's
Okay. Okay, good. Thanks. What's up, Sally? How are you? What's up? Say that again? Oh, okay. What's going on? I just saw I missed your call. I haven't looked at the voicemail yet. Yeah. Oh, okay. I don't know anything about it. You got me. Sammy just once she got in there. Exactly. Might as well. Nothing before she shot it though, right? I got you. Yeah. Already how it works.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, of course. Let me know if I can help. I'll call them and find out.
6 or 8 miles ahead.
Oh, all right, you too.
We go from Alexandria.
will now begin at 2:30.
What's the word, Doug? See where we are. See that wig give it to you? Yes. What's the word, Doug? See where we are. They said they give it 2 minutes. See that wig give it to you? Yes. Just check the E on that. The E.
Hey, there's a mic out here. I don't order me, but I'm just making sure. He's like on the chair. It, okay, great.
Hey, Christian, can we just check the E on the right? I'll likely have to do this research.
So I'm sorry we are very late, you guys. Sorry to keep you waiting. I was working with the president on something, and he wanted me to hand this out to you all, and I have it here, so I want to read it to the American public directly from the president. It has been suggested that we should rename as many as 10 of our legendary military bases, such as North Carolina, Fort Hood in Texas, Fort Benning in Georgia, and the list goes on. These monumental and very powerful bases have become part of a great American heritage of winning, victory, and freedom. The United States of America trained and deployed our heroes here in 2 world wars. Therefore, my administration will not even consider the renaming of these magnificent and fabled military installations. Our history as the great world will not be tampered with. Respect our military. So that was directly from the president. We spent working on that, and I wanted to deliver that to you. Also, I wanted to take us through a few other things related to the coronavirus. First, the coronavirus task force briefing was held yesterday. I was in it, and there was some very good news that I'd like to share with you. I don't know if you all saw, there were 2 studies that came out, very strong studies in the journal Nature. And in Europe, which had a very filed to the United States, 3.1 million lives were saved due to mitigation and the efforts taken by governments. And as Dr. Birx noted to me, she sent this to me just before I walked out here, she said it suggests that the United States also prevented over 3 million deaths, thanks to the efforts of President Trump and the American people. Another study found that the shutdown efforts prevented 50 million additional coronavirus cases. So those are 2 very encouraging studies underscoring the work of the American people. Also, the Washington Post noted that these 2 reports use completely different methods to reach similar conclusions. They suggest that the aggressive and unprecedented shutdowns were effective at halting the exponential spread of the novel coronavirus. So thank you, Washington Post, for that good reporting. The Department of Secretary Sonny Perdue also had some very good news in the task force briefing I was at yesterday. Packing facilities, at one time it looked like they were going to need to close. That was unacceptable to the administration. We took action, the coronavirus task force took action, and now I'm pleased to report that these meatpacking facilities are operating at 95% capacity compared to 2019, 98% capacity, pork at 95%, and poultry at 98%. Extraordinary efforts to slow the spread, President Trump ensured that the meat supply was and robust by directing these meatpacking facilities to safely operate in accordance with the CDC and OSHA guidelines. His efforts secured America's continual access to a steady food supply chain. Very importantly, I have some great data points to share on coronavirus testing capacity in minority communities. Admiral Brett Joie shared yesterday and last night as well. He said that when we look at testing sites, President Trump's public-private partnership with retail companies has proven quite successful. Testing sites are operating in 49 states, with 70% of these sites located in communities with moderate to high social vulnerabilities. And social vulnerability takes into account race, ethnicity, housing and economics, language barriers, and other factors. Also, federally qualified health centers, their FQHCs, serve 29 million patients in 12,000 communities across the nation. They provide care to 1 in 5 of those uninsured, 1 in 5 of rural Americans, 1 in 3 of individuals below the poverty, then 1.3 million homeless men and women, and nearly 1 million migrant agricultural workers. And 92% of these FQHCs now offer COVID tests, and we've awarded them $580 to 1,385 of these facilities. And finally, the HHS Office of Minority Health issued a competitive funding opportunity to build a strategic network of national, state, territory, tribe-based organizations that deliver vital health information and support linkages to services for racial and ethnic minorities. And this announcement, this network is scheduled to be awarded at the end of June and is expected to reach at least 40 million individuals from racial and ethnic minorities. These updates, I was told by Brett Joie, were received very well at the Senate hearings. And we thank the Vice President, Mike Pence, for doing an amazing job leading our coronavirus task force, and to President Trump, who has led in bringing America through the coronavirus pandemic. And with that, I'll take questions. Kristen.
Thank you so much. Does the president regret tweeting out a baseless conspiracy theory about a 75-year-old protester on the morning of George Floyd's funeral?
The president was asking questions about an interaction in a video clip he saw, and the president has the right to ask those questions.
But does he regret out this protester was assaulted
The president does not regret standing up for law enforcement men and women across this country. And let me say this, and just give you a little bit about the mindset behind the president's tweet. Look, we're living in a moment that is, it seems to be reflexively anti-police officer. And it's unacceptable to the president. In this tweet that he sent out, he was in no way condoning violence. He was not passing judgment on these two officers in particular. But what he was saying is this: when we see a brief snippet of a video, it's incumbent upon reporters and those who are surveying the situation to ask questions. Rather,
upon the president to have facts before he tweets anything out. He's the president of the United States.
The president did have facts before he tweeted it out that undergirded his questions.
Baseless conspiracy theory.
It's not a baseless conspiracy. No, not at all. I won't acknowledge that because look, let's contrast this to the George Floyd situation, which that horrific video that every single police officer that I saw across the country came up. This is an inexcusable action, and I condemn this police officer. In this case, there were 57 police officers who said, I resign in protest over the way these two officers were handled. And the president says those law enforcement officers have a right to be heard.
But does the president think that anything justifies that 75-year-old man being bound to the ground like we all saw?
The president does not condone violence. He wants to see the appropriate amount of police force used in any given situation, including this one, but he believes that the officers have a right to be heard.
Very quickly, George Floyd's brother is here testifying. Has the White House invited him here to meet with the president?
The president has repeated George Floyd, his passing, the egregiousness of that atrocity, and has called the family by phone, as he did last week. Yes.
The president has got an event tomorrow in Dallas, church in which he'll meet with faith leaders. He'll also meet with law enforcement officials, small business owners. The theme is a plan for holistic revitalization and recovery. Will the president be announcing any policy in regards to police reform tomorrow, and what might reform?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. And as it stands currently, the president has spent the last 10 days quietly and diligently working on proposals to address issues that the protesters have raised across the country, legitimate issues. And that body of work, I'm told, is redits, and we hope to produce it for you in the coming days. I can't promise you it's tomorrow, but in the coming days, we look to deliver that.
So what then will tomorrow be about? Will it be a listening head on Monday with law enforcement, or might there actually be some concrete policy proposals?
Yeah, it will be a round.
It could at least be done level.
It will be a round table, much like what you saw with law enforcement officers earlier in the week.
And if I could just stay on that theme for a second, in terms of reform ideas that the president could support, Democrats have floated some in the House. Senate Republicans, led by Tim Scott, are working on others, things like banning chokeholds, banning no-knock, independent process to investigate misconduct. Could the president support issues like that?
So again, don't want to get ahead of the announcements. What I would say is each issue is being looked at as to what would make a difference. Everything that you've suggested has certain ramifications, so he has to look at each of these in great few days. And I would just note one thing that AG Barr said was that in the Democrat bill, they reduce immunity to go after bad cops, but that would result in police pulling back. So that is one thing that is a non-starter.
So is that, it's called qualified immunity.
Yes.
Is that a red line for the president?
That's a non-starter in the Democrat legislation. Yes, John.
Does the president believe there's a problem with institutional racism in this country and institutional racism in law enforcement?
Look, I've answered this question. I think this is the fourth time I've said each and every time. There are injustices that we have seen. Clearly, that tape of George Floyd was inexcusable, gut-wrenching, difficult to watch, and it was really a beautiful funeral yesterday, all the great testimonies to his life. We recognize those injustices. Sandra Bland, another example, knows fundamentally that most police officers in this country are good, that the 750 men and women that have been injured, that David Dorn, the police officer, Patrick Underwood, the law enforcement officer who was killed, are emblematic of what police in this country stand for. That is the best, that is the brightest, and that is our domestic heroes. Yes.
The reason why I'm asking it now is, does he believe that action needs to be taken to fundamentally change the way law enforcement is done in this country, to make fundamental changes so that there isn't the kind of disparities that we see along racial lines?
Well, the president president's looking at various proposals, and I would say this president has done a whole lot more than Democrats have ever done when it comes to rectifying injustices, where you had the crime bill of the 90s, which created great racial disparities in our justice, and Trump rectified some of those with the First Step Act. So President Trump's about action, and he recognizes injustices and acts promptly when he sees them. Yes.
Thanks, Bailey. The president agrees with announcements from the Marines and Navy about their policies banning the display of the Confederate flag.
So I haven't spoken to him on that specific one. He does, as I noted at the top of this briefing, fervently stand against the renaming of our forts, these great American fortresses where literally some of these men and women who lost their lives as they went out to Europe and Afghanistan and Iraq and all across this world to win world wars on behalf of freedom. A lot of times the very last place they saw was one of these forts. And to suggest that these forts were somehow inherently racist and their names need to be changed is a complete to the men and women who the last bit of American land they saw overseas and lost their lives were these forts.
Just one follow-up. So an ex-judge appointed to review the Flynn case said that justice is entirely irregular conduct to benefit a political ally of the president, and he urged the presiding judge in the case to deny an attempt by the government to dismiss the charges. What is the White House reaction?
That's the first I'm hearing about. I'd point you to DOJ on that. Jeff.
Thanks, Gailey. Congressional Republicans, including Congresswoman Liz Cheney, have criticized the president's decision to reduce the number of U.S. troops in Germany. Some saying that it will embolden Russia if the United. Did the president make that decision to punish Chancellor Merkel for deciding not to come to Evin in June?
Look, I have no announcements on that front, and he never makes decisions to punish certain world leaders. He acts in the best interest of the United States.
Follow up on another issue on distance with regard to the tweet. One of the things that the president said in his tweet was that the gentleman fell harder than he was pushed. How does that work in terms of physics?
Look, the president raised based on a report he saw. He has a right to ask those questions, and where he stands is squarely with law enforcement. He was making no judgments, not condoning violence, not saying what happened in this case with these two officers was right or wrong, but he's standing back and saying we need to ask questions, lives, and convict people in the court of public opinion. Yes.
Thanks, Kelly. Two questions on the economy. First of all, both the chair of the Federal Reserve and Steve Mnuchin said today the U.S. will definitely need another round of stimulus. How urgent is that for the president? I mean, how soon do we expect him to meet with Democrats to discuss the next legislation?
Yeah, it's a good question. He met on a potential Phase 4 policy last week. It was a very promising discussion with his economic. So that's in the works as to when and if we see that, but it is a topic of discussion. He was encouraged by the jobs report. We were supposed to lose 7.5 million jobs, we're gaining 2.5 million, a swing by 10 million. It was described to me as one of the, by one famed, one of the worst miscalculations of economists in history to be off by 10 million. That's the size of Michigan. The president's encouraged because what we're seeing is a belief in the Trump economy and the Trump presidency. What we're seeing is the market soar. We're seeing the S&P have its best 50-day track record in history because they believe in a president that has free market policies that got us to the hottest economy in modern history and will get us, yes.
The Federal Reserve today offered a pretty grim economic outlook, saying unemployment is going to be elevated for years. And also this week, we heard from the National Bureau that the U.S. officially entered a recession. What is the White House response to that?
We believe that next month's jobs report will be robust. The president has been clear that Q4, he expects Q3 to be a transition period, Q4 to be robust, and next year to be a very hot year. And I would note that those they were off by 10 million. That's not too good. So I'd go back and look at some of the models that were off. The jobs report was last time, including 300,000 new jobs for Black Americans. Yes.
Thank you so much. The president met with Mitch McConnell today, we understand. Can you kind of fill us in on what that discussion was about? Any updates?
So I have no announcements on that front. Those were his private meetings, so no announcements out of that.
Can I just add to John's question? You know, a lot of people are concerned that there is, you mentioned justice disparities. There's a lot of concern of some Americans that police officers treat Black individuals and people of color differently than white individuals. Share those specific concerns.
Here's what he's concerned about. He's concerned about and I've told you he's addressed injustices with Sandra Bland and George Floyd and has repeatedly acknowledged that. But here is, in addition to that, his concern, put very well by New York's Police Benevolent Association President Mike O'Meara. Our legislators are failing us. Our press is vilifying us. He's saying us as police officers, stop treating us like animals and thugs. We've been vilified, and it's disgusting. When you have a sitting congressman, Ilhan Omar, calling cops cancer, what do you think that leads to? The AP reported on a shooting in front of a police department today in California. Let's stop vilifying our officers. Let's recognize and see it, but recognize all of us in here are safe because of our police officers doing their job each and every day.
I understand that, but there are concerns among many Americans that people of color are not treated the same by police, and that is what many of the protests have been about. Does the president share those specific concerns?
The president believes most of our police officers are good, hardworking men and women, like David Dorn, who was killed among these riots, like Patrick Underwood, who was killed among these riots. Those are our officers. They are our best. They are our brightest. They're absolute places of injustice. We're addressing those. We're looking at legislative proposals and EOs, and we'll see in the coming days as to what will. But stop vilifying our officers, because they deserve better than that. They're out there. They're working hard. 750 injured just in the last week and a half, and we need to recognize that. Yes.
Back on the Buffalo protester, is the president disappointed that more Republicans have not lined up to support the questions he asked, to use characterization of it, which many people also characterize it as a conspiracy theory? And secondly, has the president reached out either to the injured gentleman or to the police officers involved?
So first of all, President Trump, I would say, he's not focused on what Republicans are saying or not saying on the Hill. He's focused on making changes. As I said, he's been diligently hard at work, and that is where his focus squarely lies at the moment. Yes.
Thanks, Kelly. The gentleman,
not that I'm aware of. No. Not that I'm aware of. Hello.
Thanks,
Yes.
You started this briefing reading off some statistics about success of mitigation efforts on the spread of COVID, but we're now seeing a spike in cases in more than a dozen states and increased hospitalizations in a lot of those as well. So, and many public health experts attribute these spikes to Memorial Day weekend gatherings and other aspects of the reopening process before these mass protests. So why is President Trump continuing given this trend, and should we be slowing down a little bit on the reopening process?
First, let me know as it pertains to Memorial Day. A week ago today, the Biden task force that day, but that it was said that in fact that there was no linkage to Memorial Day as being some point of spurring wild outbreaks in the nation. What I would say, though, I talked to Dr. Birx, and she said what we've seen is averaged out to be about 30,000 cases a day. May was about 25,000 cases a day. Currently, we're at around 20,000 cases a day. And you've got to look in a nuanced way at each of, for instance, Texas is one of the places where they're saying we're seeing a steady slope, not a huge rise, but part of it's in due to the fact that they're testing in long-term care facilities and in prisons, and the more testing you do, the more cases you identify.
Can I ask a follow-up? Sure. President Trump is planning to restart campaign rallies within the next few weeks. What sort of precautions is he going to be taking at his rallies for the safety of the rally-goers?
So we have no rallies announced just yet. You're right about the 2-week timeline that was put forward. But we will ensure that everyone who goes is safe, but no specific announcements on that front. And I would direct you to the campaign for more information on that. Yes.
So I've taken my question. Owen Jensen with EWTN News. We've seen thousands of people in the streets protesting, exercising their constitutional right. Those, of course, doing it peacefully. At the same time, churches in many cases told to limit their 10 or no more. Does the president see a double standard there, constitutionally speaking? And if, can you explain, please?
There are absolute double standards that we've seen, and that's why the Justice Department set up a task force, if you will, or a group to look at civil liberties as during coronavirus shutdowns. I read about one case where you had an allowance of outside gathering and protest, but indoor churches could not gather, even with socially distanced protocols. He absolutely sees an issue. There have been several cases pointed to where people attending church in their cars were targeted by law enforcement officers. So that's unacceptable. People should be allowed to worship. We have a First Amendment in this country. There's a way to safely do it. I went to Mass and was able to safely attend, distance from people, and there were appropriate protocols that were taken in that case, and that's what we hope to see, as the president made eminently clear a few weeks ago.
Not too long ago, he asked for all churches to reopen. Is he happy with the progress or no?
He's happy with the progress. generous. I've seen, in fact, that very week, a church that I visited reopened, a church down the road from me. So I think he gave a lot of courage to the faith community to reopen, to do so safely. And look, here we are, I think 4 weeks later, and we haven't been hearing about, rampant outbreaks in places of worship. The First Amendment's a beautiful thing. People have a right to go to church or mosque or synagogue. Yes.
Yes, hi, Kelly, thanks. Still on COVID, it seems pretty unconcerned so far about November and the COVID situation, whether people are going to be afraid to go to the polls or whether there's going to be a lot of delays because of the COVID. You recently said it's a long way off, I think meaning the pandemic would have died down by then, essentially. But given that it hasn't actually gone away, people are obviously still dying every day, and there are some, it's not that far away, 5 months. Are any measures being taken at all to this election is going to go smoothly and everyone who wants to vote can vote?
Yeah, well, I have criticism of the protest and socially distance and mitigation efforts. I think there's a way to safely vote if you can safely protest, and that's what the president would like to see. There's a way to safely vote. There's a way to safely go to church, and you're asking a hypothetical about something 5 months from now at a time, ironically, when the media hasn't expressed much outrage about a lack of mitigation efforts taken by some of the protesters. Raquel.
Thank you so much, Katie. 2 questions. First, is the president consider the protest could lead to another outbreak? And a second question, President Trump said that he does not believe the death toll in coronavirus cases figures from some countries. Does he trust the figure from Brazil? Is the White House concerned that the Brazilian government is hiding information about COVID-19?
To him about the Brazil numbers, but I have heard him on several cases, probably at least in that he'd seen what's going on in Brazil, and he was hurt to see how many people have been affected by COVID down there. So he has mentioned Brazil specifically. I believe he even sent some ventilators to Brazil because we had such an overflow of ventilators here because America really, under the leadership of President Trump, snapped into action and shored up what was supposed to be a ventilator shortage and delivered, this administration delivered. I would just note that he's mentioned great concern for the people of Brazil.
Kelly, just the first question that I asked, is the president concerned the protests could lead to another outbreak of coronavirus?
During that, right now we're encouraged to see that cases have declined month over month, but the vet out here said the task force is well aware of monitoring individual situations in particular states. Niels.
Kaylee, thank you. To where you started with the statement about renaming the military bases, if Congress were to send over, say, the defense authorization with language that were to rename one of these bases for someone who, say, was a general who won the Civil War, the president veto the defense authorization?
The president will not be signing America's forts. It's example. It's one of the largest military installations. It's home to tens of thousands of brave American soldiers. And when you think of Fort Bragg, we think of the brave soldiers that deployed from there. World War II airborne divisions, the 82nd, the 101st, the 11th, the 13th, and the 17th, all trained at Fort Bragg. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, this was the first Black Parachute Battalion trained at this fort. We must recognize the sacrifices made by these men and women, some of whom saw Fort Bragg for the last time they went overseas. We've got to think in Hurricane Katrina and the earthquake in Haiti. We've got to honor what has happened there, not rename it. So that is an absolute non-starter for the president. And I would also note...
One more question on that.
Yeah, John.
One more question on that. General David Petraeus is one of those people who went through Fort Bragg a number of times, even though his first command was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He penned a lengthy and detailed editorial about the reasons why those bases should be renamed. It's ironic that American soldiers and Marines are being trained at bases named for people who fought against the Union back in the Civil War, that many of the bases are named where leaders held in questionable regard, but who were elevated during the Lost Cause movement. He goes on to say, we do not live in a country to which Braxton Bragg, Henry L. Bang, or Robert E. Lee can serve as an inspiration. What does the White House say to that particular point of view?
Fort Bragg is known for the heroes within it that trained there, that deployed from there, and it's an insult to say to the men and women the last thing they saw on American soil before going overseas, to tell them that what they left was inherently a racist institution because of a name. That's unacceptable to the president, and rightfully so. And I would also note, where do you draw? I'm told that no longer can you find on HBO Gone with the Wind because somehow that is now offensive. Where do you draw the line? Should George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison be erased from? What about FDR and because of internment camps? You know, should he be erased from history, or Lyndon Johnson, who has a history of documented racist statements? And finally, what about people, media, to be segregationist? NBC tells us Joe Biden didn't just compromise with segregationists, he fought for their causes in schools, experts say. CNN tells us letters from Joe Biden reveal how he sought support of segregationists in the fight against busing. And Washington Post tells us that Biden's tough talk on 1970s schools desegregation plans could get him new scrutiny. And there are several more where that came from. So I'll leave you with the question, should we then rename the Biden Welcome Center? Thanks very much, guys.
One quick follow-up on
Very much, guys.
One quick follow-up on
唔好害人哋啲仔女啦！好心啊，啲行徑有乜辛苦？日日打黑色衫，打黑色衫，我哋嘅後生仔。好心啊，啲行徑天日日爭取打交，爭取打交，又破壞香港。打全外，打全外，打議員，打議員，打女仔，打女仔，打死黑警，打爛呢個家園啊！死黑警又唔做嘢，又唔讀書，死黑警點解我哋唔做事？愛人嘅睇女我唔該。全家仔，黑警，我冇罪㗎，點解要搞我咧？黑警就係我哋仇人，黑警日日鬧事，黑警破壞香港法例，黑警就係我哋仇人，黑警日日鬧事。黑警破壞香港法例，黑警破壞香港法例，香港法例，香港法例。